The Business Advisory Group presents a webinar series, Surviving, Thriving, and Growing Your Business Through the Pandemic. Each of these webinars features New England Provisors members. The Business Advisory Group connects professional expertise within the Provisors Network with the resources that business owners need to improve the value, efficiency, and profitability of their businesses. Each of the sessions, starting on September 29 and continuing through November 18, feature provisor experts in each of the categories noted. All of the sessions begin at 2 p.m. Eastern and will be rebroadcast over our YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy the sessions and contact each of the experts if you have questions that are important to you as a business owner. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lee Adelson of the Bulfinch Group and your moderator for today's session, Hiring and Managing in the Workplace in the New Normal. Today, we're going to discuss how the business owner, in leading by example, can develop a strategy to succeed by following COVID rules, distinguishing between layoffs and furloughs, and recruiting staff based on functions needed to grow and thrive in a pandemic world. A few suggestions for the session. On the top of your screen, under View Options, we suggest that you uncheck side-by-side mode and set the zoom ratio to window. With us today are Monica Horan of Express Employment Professionals, David Robinson, Employment Attorney with Ruberto, Israel, and Weiner, and Warren Rutherford, owner of the Executive Suite. Before we begin, let's have Monica, David, and Warren introduce themselves. And I'd also like to provide Dominic Grew, our co-host today, an opportunity to introduce himself as well. Monica, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica Horan, owner of Express Employment Professionals in Braintree. We are a full-service staffing agency working with primarily small to medium-sized businesses to fill both permanent and temporary positions. We specialize in manufacturing, distribution, and professional services.
Thanks, Monica. David, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I am good. Thank you, everyone, for attending this event. Hopefully, it will be informative to you. My name is David Robinson. I'm an employment attorney at the law firm Roberto, Israel, and Weiner. I help small to mid-sized employers and advise them on anything employment related, including handbooks, investigations of employee complaints, claims of harassment, wage and hour litigation, and then anything on the discrimination side, whether it's dealing with the state agencies, the EEOC, the MCAD, dealing with the Department of Labor, soup to nuts, anything employment related. So hopefully you'll enjoy this great presentation today.
Great, David. Thank you. We're looking forward to it. Warren, nice to see you again.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you for having me this afternoon, along with the distinguished panelists that introduced themselves before me. I'm Warren Rutherford, owner of the Executive Suite. So I provide talent assessment systems, management and executive coaching, training, and all things solving people problems. So if you hear a client complain about their employees, see excessive employee turnover, or a decrease in customer satisfaction, it's a good sign they need my help, and I do look forward to participation this afternoon and learning a little bit more from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. We're looking forward to this panel discussion. I'd like to introduce our co-host today, Dominic Grew. Dominic, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Lee. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dominic Grew. I'm the owner and the founder of Elevate Business Coaching, and I work with business owners, business leaders, and executives, really to help them accomplish their business goals faster and with greater success than they would on their own. Quite a big task in a normal event, but an even bigger task when we're going through a pandemic like we are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm Lee Adelson. I'm a financial advisor and representative with the Bulfinch Group, I provide uncommon thinking to yield uncommon results for business owners by implementing insurance strategies to attract, retain, and reward owners and key employees, as well as for their transitions due to growth, sale, succession, and retirement. For today's session, Monica, David, and Warren are here to discuss how the business owner can lead by example, distinguishing between layoffs and furloughs, and recruiting staff based on function and need to grow and thrive. If you have any questions, please list them in the Q&A box. We will address them as we present during our discussion. And a reminder that our session is being recorded. So panelists, let's begin. Today's topic, hiring and managing in the workplace in the new normal. Managing the workplace under COVID-19 has been a very different challenge. David, what are you finding to be the most substantial issues from COVID-19 that employers are facing in this workplace?
Unfortunately, there are lots of issues that are coming up, whether it comes from bringing the employees back, dealing with employees that are obviously reasonably concerned about returning to the workplace, whether they're a business that's been in business that's been an essential business that's been operating all along, or whether they just are starting to bring people back to work now that the summer's over. You can see now that there are a lot of problems that are coming up that I saw that were coming up previously in April. It's employees, you're seeing an uptick in employees that are getting infected, that they're being exposed to people infections, and how to deal with that, how to enforce workplace policies and procedures related to COVID, such as wearing a mask, wearing PPE, and then dealing with the general issues of employee disputes that are now being amplified because of all the pressure that everybody's under, both in trying to get the workplace back up and running, and then dealing with things such as employees having children that are going to school maybe remotely or in a hybrid model where some days they're in work, some days they're not, and how to juggle all that, how to juggle the fact that you have employees working from home and then working in the office. So I would say that there are a lot of issues that employers unfortunately have to deal with specifically due to COVID that are not only not going away, I think they're now getting worse again, unfortunately.
Sounds like those problems are compounded both in the workplace, but also for the employees. Warren, what are you finding for the employer to lead by example, to provide a strategy for them to succeed? What business strategies are you seeing?
Well, what's interesting, Lee, is that when the pandemic first hit, there was a fast scramble to try to figure out if you were an essential business or not. And depending on the answer to that, you still needed to develop a business strategy and plan or continue the one that you had, if you had one. What I've seen as important, however, is that every business needs to develop their business strategy and plan to grow the company through the pandemic, through at least the end of 2021. And it's a different plan and strategy than what they've been accustomed to every year, but because it's an adaptation on that. So several factors get involved in this planning process. One is basing the plan first on COVID-19 protocol, as David mentioned, personal protective equipment, distancing, etc., meetings. Next, they need to understand how each employee function needs to be adjusted to comply with those COVID requirements, and then adjusting those functions in their interactions with other employees and customers or clients. And then finally, determining how that business plan is going to allow that company to maintain business within the protocol, whether you're an essential business or not. If you weren't that essential business, you had to wait, in Massachusetts anyways, to the governor's orders to what type and kind and timing on your business would be. So those issues have impacted sales, marketing, product, service delivery, staffing, the whole thing. So encouraging business owners, if they haven't done it yet, to take their strategy and plan to go through 2021 so they can anticipate and budget for and execute a modified business plan.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that planning for the long term and understanding what those requirements are going to be is going to be important. Monica,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Monica is someone providing employment services What are some of the tips that you're seeing to deal with? How would you look at companies recruiting during a COVID-19 environment?
Well, the game has definitely changed. There are a lot more challenges now to finding people. We were in an extremely tight labor market pre-COVID, and even with the increase in unemployment in our state, we're still seeing difficulties filling positions. Aside from that, there are companies that haven't maybe adapted their systems to allow for online applications, telephone or Zoom interviews. And we have to be mindful, employers have to be mindful of the concerns that employees have in moving within this market or taking on a new position. They want employers to show that they are first looking at safety as the #1 priority, but are also flexible because there are so many new needs and challenges that we're all dealing with. So I think employers need to look at their strategy in terms of, how am I going to reach people now when almost, the majority of business is being done electronically? We're functioning like we are right here, doing things remotely, not as much face-to-face connection. How are they going to get people to apply for positions they have open? And part of that means that they may have to adapt systems that they currently have to offer future employees an easier way to learn about their business, how they're addressing COVID, and how to apply and interview for a position.
So as someone providing employees, there's a lot of different aspects that have to be looked at, not only providing the employment, the legal aspect, as David mentioned, and the strategy that Warren is talking about. They all have to go together in managing this specific issue. And it's always changing.
Leah, and I'd like to add to what Monica put in for potential applicants to any job in any company. What I'm finding, and you may as well, Monica, is that there's a reluctance from potential applicants to apply for a job for two reasons. If they're unemployed and they're staying at home, that's a safe, secure environment. They're sort of pandemic proof. They're, quarantining themselves at home. Moving to a new job creates some level of risk and uncertainty. If you're currently in a job as an employee and you're considering applying for a new job, the current job you have is a safe COVID environment, presumably. Considering that move to a new position is somewhat of a risk as well. So there's some uncertainty there, and employers need to be prepared to become counselors, psychologists, so to speak, and listening to the concerns and fears of those potential applicants, because it's real. And there's a lot of nervousness out there in the marketplace.
And like pre-pandemic, I think because of the labor shortages, employers have to consider, what incentives can I offer a potential employee? What am I going to dangle in front of them that will get them to feel comfortable coming to my workplace or working from home for me? What benefits or flexibility or care even can I offer to just deal with those potential objections?
Good point.
Dominic, I see that we have a few questions in the queue. Do you have, would you like to chime in with those?
Yeah, I have one here, and it's probably specifically for you, David, but I'm just thinking about what Warren just said about having to be psychologists and counselors as well. David, I can only imagine how many people you've spoken to over the last few months, specifically business owners. And so the question really is, what tips, if you could put it down to just a few tips for business owners when it comes to bringing people back, what tips do you have for them?
All right, absolutely, yeah. And I'll tell you, being a lawyer, you're often putting on your psychiatrist hat and sitting down and talking through the issues with the employers, because they don't really have, when you're running a business, it's hard to talk to people about things. So you often do that. So I can empathize on that. The first thing you need to have when you're reopening your business to your workforce, you got to have a written plan. It's required by law under the mass reopening plan. So if you haven't done one, as an owner, you need to do one. Go on to the Reopen Massachusetts site. They have a template that you have to show, and it talks about how are you social distancing, how are you doing sanitation and washing hands in the workplace regularly, how are you maintaining social distance, how are you training your employees and how to do all of those things. It's important. It's not just for the legal touch the base. It's important for your employees to know that these things are in place. In fact, one of the number one things that employees, when they hear they're coming back, the number one concern is, well, how am I going to be safe? Well, this written plan, when you give it to your employees, will inherently show them all the things you're doing. And it helps you think through the problems before the people are in the workplace, because once they're there, it's very difficult to make changes. So for instance, if you need to make structural changes to how your desks are set up, this is critical. You need to think, when you're doing your plan, you want to think about who should be coming back, because you're under the law, you're not allowed to have a full occupancy work site. It's at top right now, 50% for office space. And that's going to change, but it could change either way. So you need to understand who are the people that are critical for us to be in the office to keep business going. And then who are the people that we can have in once or twice a week to kind of keep things moving. And the last thing you want to think about on that aspect is think about whether you want a cohort, whether you, like schools are doing now, they're splitting their classes in two, and they're having one set come in one day, one set coming in the other day. So there's no cross-contamination. I've had employers who've had to shut down their entire work site for 2 weeks because everyone was exposed to COVID-19. Therefore, the Department of Health immediately came in and said, you got to shut down for 2 weeks now until everybody's clear. So had they cohorted, they wouldn't have had to shut their business down and lose 2 weeks worth of revenue because it was a retail style business. So that's kind of the first key tip. The next thing when you're thinking about is when you're bringing people back, how are you educating them? How are you training them? It's important that they understand the process and procedure, because it only takes one person not understanding it. I had a client this summer who had an employee that was sick and walked all the way into the plant and then walked up face to face to his supervisor without wearing PPE to tell him he was sick. That's a terrible result, because you might have to shut down the entire plant based on that one aspect. So it's always the weakest link that's going to cause the most problems. So it's really important that you have education. And the last thing, which is less legal, but you got to be flexible and understand that every employee has their own thresholds on what they're willing to accept and what risks they're going to take. So you have to understand that and be patient and understanding, especially because right now everybody thinks that this thing is now on the wane, when in reality, the numbers are showing that it's going to be picking up going into winter. There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to be back in possibly April situations in over the next few months. It could possibly go that way. So you need to be prepared for that and understand, what am I going to do if it does come to that? If the governor does shift it backwards into a stage 2, or even, God forbid, a stage 1, how do we deal with that? So it's important to think about those things as well, which is less legal, but still just as critical to your business.
It's interesting. I have another question on that. You mentioned there about this thing waning, but that's not how it's looking. And actually, someone here has just asked about COVID-19, the fatigue that's been setting in, where 6 months plus in lockdown with this, and what advice that you might have for management teams. They thought they were coming up for air, but it seems like things are going in the opposite direction. So any quick thoughts, insights there on that?
Well, I would say that they did come up to air in that situation, but right now we're about to go under another wave. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with what we do going forward. I think the part of the problem now is fatigue has set in. So people are becoming more lax with their procedures, not necessarily in the office, but outside the office. I think now is a good time to have a meeting with your employees to kind of discuss this whole point. I get everybody's tired of this, but we need to be vigilant, because if you don't, it could put us out of business and everybody out of a job. And I think the stakes are high enough that's critical, especially like a situation like a restaurant. Numbers are very important to them, because if they get shut down through all the holiday season, that's going to be killer to their business. So it's less about talking about this in terms of, yeah, I get it. This may not be a big deal for you because you get sick and you're fine with that risk. But keep in mind that the numbers are important overall, because that will cause the governor to be more reactionary in how he handles business going forward. So it's critical that over the next few weeks, months, that we keep the numbers low so that we can keep operating business, at least at this level, and hopefully things will be better. But I think it's critical to talk to employees about that and have a frank discussion with the employees about that, because I think everybody's on the same page here. Nobody wants to go back to where we were in early April, where everybody's stuck at home doing nothing, and that's where we could be again. If you look at Europe, there are countries that have already gone back to those measures, and we're about a 3-week trailer behind Europe on this. So
let me take a quick tack on what David said. So during normal times, it's a lot easier to create opportunities to show employees we care and that you value their participation in helping their business succeed. So employers, yeah, we've got the fatigue. Now, I think all of us are suffering from it as well. But remember, your employees come to work every day, leave work every day. They come there for a purpose. So think of some strategies that you can use as an employer to get them more engaged. It may be in helping you to modify your business strategy. It may be appropriate events, collaboration, perhaps contests. Sounds silly, but I've heard of employers trying contests online to just play little games online. Simple things work. But most of all, is David emphasized, be and remain flexible to their personal needs, especially family needs, where the employees who may have children in school or significant others who have been impacted by the pandemic, be willing to make those adjustments and be engaged with your employees. Your employees will respond. It's going to be a long haul. That's why I said earlier, structure your plan and strategy through the end of 2021. It's not just 6 to 8 months. It's another, 12 to 14 months.
Another consideration is to not let your guard down. Make sure that you and your managers are always vigilant to ensure that if someone is not following policies and procedures, you need to correct that immediately and remind everyone that this is how it has to be, that, you're not going to let anything slide by, that everybody has to be really diligent.
Yeah, I to tack on to what Monica said, that's a great point, because I've had clients that did not have the people at the top following the rules. They were refusing to wear masks, and they've had nothing but problems, because it's really hard to have people follow the rules if your people from the top aren't doing it. So it's got to be leadership. This is in times of crisis, leadership is critical. And so that means you, as running the business, your C-suite people, they all need to be following the rules, because if they're not, you can't expect that the rank and file will do it if you're not.
And leading by example is key in that aspect of things. And I think that's a really great place to understand that. Let's move on to while companies have laid off several people, and it still may be an issue to going forward as this continues. It's like, let's address some of the unemployment issues that businesses are facing. They've faced it, they may face it again. So, Dave, looking at this, how do you define the difference between layoffs and furloughs, and who should you hire back and when and why? And how do you manage that aspect of things?
So it's funny that the term furlough used in private business is a relatively new term. It used to be exclusively used in the federal government when the federal government decided to do a lockdown. because they couldn't get the budget passed. So everybody went on a furlough. What it means in private business, and it's really been a unique thing created for the coronavirus, is you're essentially telling employees, we don't have work for you right now, but we will give you something, some sort of benefit, whether it's healthcare continuation, whether it might be partial pay or something along those lines. And you're then essentially temporarily laying them off to then, with the idea that it's 6-8 weeks, you bring them back. Like, this is big in the restaurant industry, where because the restaurants were closed, they didn't just want to lay off their workforce, because then it would have been harder to get them back when they were allowed to reopen. So what they did was they created these furlough situations where they said, we're going to be closed for X amount of weeks until the governor says we can reopen. Here's what our plan is. Here's what we want you to do. But the nice part about the furlough, the advantage of the furlough was an employee could apply for unemployment in Massachusetts and receive it without having to look for a new job. In a layoff situation, that's a permanent situation. Typically, you're now severing that employee, and they're now free to go look for any other employment. And in fact, in order to collect unemployment, they have to look for employment, or they have to do some sort of training. They have to do something to certify that they're actually looking for a new job. So what I tell employers when they're thinking about the two, the question is one, how highly skilled is your workforce? If you have a highly skilled workforce, the last thing you want to do is lay them off and have them go elsewhere into the economy and then not be able to pull them back. So a furlough would be much better. Whereas if it's a more fungible workforce that's more manual labor, things that don't require high skilled individuals, maybe there a layoff makes more sense, because then you're not having the slow bleed of paying for healthcare or paying some other benefit to the employees. But basically the primary difference between the two is the permanent nature of a layoff versus the more temporary of a furlough.
Right. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Warren, when you look at businesses reorganizing and looking at things a different way and behaving and managing differently, what types and kinds of employees does a company need in order to survive and thrive in this environment? How do they look at their employee needs at that point?
Great question, Lee. Thank you. So let's go back to what we've talked about from the beginning of this series in session 1, is developing that business strategy and plan to move through the pandemic, not only to survive, but to thrive and grow. So the question I have for employers is, are the employees who have been laid off or furloughed, as David explained, going to be called back? When? And do their skill sets match the company's continuing needs to thrive and grow? And a key here is to understand what owners need to do to implement their business strategy. First, they need to identify who amongst those who have been laid off or furloughed are going to be important for them to fulfill the strategies they've developed in their plan. And I'm talking here at least through, again, the end of 2021. So a key question for employers is they have to answer the why of bringing someone back, and it needs to relate back to that strategy and plan they've developed.
And Monica, one of the questions comes up as far as, given that Massachusetts has a very high unemployment rate, and, you look at the underlying causes of this, can you speak to some of that? And what are some of the industry sectors that are contributing to Massachusetts being a higher unemployment rate than others?
Surely. Well, prior to the pandemic, we had one of the lowest unemployment rates of the majority of states. So we actually did a deeper dive as a result of that. Because we had such low unemployment, we're now having one of the highest unemployments. A lot of that has been specifically to a number of industries that are very, important in the Boston metro area. And so we've seen hits to the restaurant and hotel industries, primarily because tourism is over. We're not having anybody coming into the city. also we're a huge sports city and entertainment is huge. So between sports and the theater and music venues that almost always sell out here, we've seen huge hits to those industries. And then other industries that are very important to Massachusetts, education and healthcare, they also, suffered a bit. Pretty much every business has been affected somehow by this pandemic. There are a few outliers that maybe are doing great, but everybody has had to adapt and really change and explore new ways of doing business. And now we do have another challenge again. And it's that even though our unemployment rate is so high, we're still having challenges finding people. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier of us needing to be flexible and be safe and let employees know that, there are opportunities for them and that there's going to be growth and security in moving within those new opportunities.
It's great to have a diverse economy, but when things like this hit, it hits across the board.
Mhm.
Yeah. Dominic, I see that we have another question in the queue.
Yeah, so the question here is, do you need to give a final check when you're notifying an employee of a furlough? So David, I don't know if you want to check that one, maybe from a legal perspective, first of all.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, you don't need to do it when you notify them. The triggering date is when you actually terminate their services. So when they're no longer working there, that's considered, as far as the Wage Act is concerned, a quote unquote termination. So you'd still have to pay them on the date that you terminate them. I typically advise clients, if you can time your payroll with the last day of work, which can be hard because sometimes you're paying them in advance, so that doesn't work. But if you're paying them, you try to time your payroll date with the date of the furlough, then it's not an issue because they're getting paid for the last date of their work. But under mass law, yes, when you terminate an employee, even temporarily, you have to have a check for them in hand when you do that, when they actually leave. Not if you notify them that it's going to be 2 weeks from now, you don't have to pay them then. It's when on the date.
David, a follow-up question on that. If you fail to pay them that check on their last day, are there legal implications at all?
Yes, technically that's a Wage Act violation. So which comes
Wonderful.
with it. Yeah, unfortunately, yes. But I'll tell you, practically speaking, if you pay them within a week, it's probably not going to have it. There's no, it's not, the AG's not going to go after you. The Attorney General wouldn't bring a claim for that. In general, they just want to make sure the employee gets paid. However, theoretically, if a lawyer took it, technically they could get treble damages and attorney's fees on a late payment, which I've never seen a case about that, but technically that exists. So my advice the conservative advice is to pay the employee as they walk out the door, because it's just easier. Saves your necessary heartache.
And just to follow up, this is a little bit of a technical question, but this is good because the devil's in the detail. What if the employee happens to be paid by direct deposit? How does that factor in to something like this?
Well, you could still do a manual check in there. I've had clients actually just simply handwrite a check out, and maybe they don't get all the deductions and the notification of the deductions, but they do a handwritten check to them and then just stop it. But if it's direct, then typically what I say is you should try to time the termination with the direct payment, so they're paid for the day that they work, and that's it. Even if you have to pay them a little more because there might be some overage, I think that saves you a lot of trouble. But it depends on your payroll provider. It depends on how complicated your payroll is, and unfortunately every case is different, and the devil is in the details on that.
Great questions.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dave, one last legal question. Are there legal concerns that an employer should be aware of, whether it's a layoff or a furlough, or bringing them back from a layoff or a furlough?
Yeah, I think the critical thing is, historically, every time we've had a downturn, what happens is that employers might use the layoff system as a way to clear the dead weight. Well, the problem is that dead weight means different things to different people. To a plaintiff's attorney, that means discrimination. So what's important when you make a decision on any type of layoff, and this is whether furlough, layoff, any type of situation where you're doing a mass employment action, you want to make sure you have a business justification for what you're doing that actually has backup. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a false reason given why you did something. Because in Massachusetts, if you give a false reason, a jury is entitled to presume that that was given in order to hide a discriminatory motive. So even if it wasn't a discriminatory motive, you just didn't like the person because they were annoying. That doesn't matter. The fact is that a jury's entitled to show the fact that you gave a false reason is enough to go to a jury, and a jury is entitled to presume that that was for some discrimination. Because why wouldn't you give the true reason is the thought process behind it. So it's important when you do these plans, you have a rationale for what you're doing. The ideal perfect world scenario is you create a formula and then you apply it to your workforce. And that way, it's very mathematical and that's easy to defend. Now, obviously that's not realistic for small employers usually because they don't have that many employees. So it's really important that you create criteria on why you're picking one person over another, because otherwise you leave yourself open for that person who got severed to have a claim against you for some sort of discrimination. And especially look at the demographics of what you're doing afterwards too, before you actually pull the trigger. It might show you that you just laid off everybody who was over 75 and you kept everybody younger than 40. That's not a good look, and that'll end up being in litigation. So it's important to also look at your demographics after you've done it or before you bring everyone back.
Yeah, sorry to jump in there, Dave.
No
Documentation is an important factor in that as well.
Yeah, documentation is the number one thing you do in any employment situation. That's the defense to everything, is documenting what you did, because 3 years later when a lawsuit happens, nobody's going to remember why they did something. So that document becomes your roadmap of your defense, and it becomes your exhibit A of the defense, frankly.
Sure.
Lee,
Warren?
that's where you list 1-800-CALL Dave. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Not at all.
I think it's obvious to call Dave on that concern.
We'll have my blinking number up on the screen shortly.
Operators are standing by for you, Dave.
Yeah, seriously.
So let's move on. Let's talk about the owner's concerns and some things that are important there. Warren, when it comes to recruiting staff based on functions and the need to grow and thrive, hugely important, especially now. How will an owner evaluate or assess matching the business strategy to a recruitment and management strategy?
Thanks, Lee. It's a simple answer with a little bit of detail to it. They need to take that strategy of their business plan and identify what types and kinds of functions are going to be necessary to help that plan be implemented. And from a recruitment process and assessment process, there's a number of practices that businesses use. Some are very good, and quite frankly, some need improvement. The businesses need to evaluate their recruiting, onboarding, and training processes, as well as their promotional processes, understanding that the recruitment, promotional processes, training processes are going to require, I'm going to use that word again, some flexibility based on their plan. Certain functions may not be required right now. Other functions may have a heightened need for being implemented. So when they're going through that matching process on recruiting and then managing, they need to be flexible. They need to consider what functions are most important and which functions are nice to have, but not essential to have, to use that essential function piece, and then adapt to that. So that kind of plays back into a legal concern that, Dave sort of talked about with layoffs and furloughs. It may be that 45-year-old who got laid off, or that 75-year-old who unfortunately might have been laid off, has the functions and skill sets to help implement that business plan. They need to make a justification, run it by their attorney, that this matches the plan. If not, then they need to be willing to take the advice of counsel to make adjustments to that. So it's not as cut and dry as it may sound. They really do need to look at who they laid off and why, and who they're going to bring back and why, and then adjust their recruitment and assessment practices to it. Sounds easy. It's not so easy, but they need to go through that process and understand and justify it, because the next call they need to make is to council to make sure that it passes muster.
And it's much easier to be proactive in that, making that call before, as opposed to making that call after, when there's a separation that may cause problems.
Yeah, Lee, if I can
Definitely
jump on
make the
that.
case before, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin said it best: an ounce of prevention is equal to a pound of cure. And that's there's no truer place in the legal world than it is in employment. If you call me before you do something, it's going to cost you nothing. If you call me after you do something, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially, because it could be a litigation, and then it just becomes crazy expensive.
So again, it goes back to any business strategy change. It's documenting those as a plan or a policy, and then making sure that the employees know about it.
Absolutely.
Follow suit.
Yeah.
Great. Monica, we've talked in the past earlier today about some of the different industries have been adversely affected: hospitality, restaurants, and so forth. When it comes to hiring new workers, what opportunities are there that have been displaced by COVID for people that are looking for a job? Where are the opportunities?
I think that I know it's hard to see anything but challenges during this time, but there actually are lots of opportunities for businesses to find critical people. Every business needs customer service people, and had tens of thousands of customer service people displaced and currently not working. They may not have your industry experience, so you have to adapt and understand that you may have to put a training program in place or make modifications to an existing training program. But if you're looking to add customer service, management, sales and marketing, those people also, highly displaced. Now's the time to start your recruiting. And again, you have to have a compelling reason for them to join your company. But, like we've said, we've pointed out the major things that employees are looking for. So if you can capitalize on that, now is the time to make an investment so that when we do come out of this at some point in 2021, you're better set to execute your plan and strategy and move on from, hopefully this is just going to be a hiccup. At some point in time, we'll look back on it and say, yep, we're glad we got through that.
And it goes to planning ahead, but that's where you're talking about forward thinking as an employer, looking for the right employees that can do that, that can fill that role.
Yeah.
And some of those employees may have to change their skill set, I would imagine, as well, in order to fit that.
Oh, there's, and again, that goes to employers who are willing to invest. One of the challenges we saw pre-COVID was that companies were so busy that they didn't want to train people. And I think that that's a mistake that a lot of businesses make. They want people that are already prepared to hit the ground running in their business. But the reality is that there are a lot of people out there that have great skills and capabilities, but they may not have the exact experience that your business needs. And there's no reason why you can't offer classes, online classes, training, on the job training, and come up with plans to bring people in and truly make an investment in them. I think that employees really value employers that show that they value them. And that can go really far to keeping employees, which, you know, every employer knows how expensive it is to bring somebody on. You want that person to stay with you and have a reason to, you know, to stay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Warren, go ahead. I think,
No, I was agreeing with what she said.
yep.
Great
I think-
points.
Yep. And I think that's a great point because the workplace environment has changed dramatically. People are working in different ways and in different places. You know, how does an employer address the differences in work environments? And, you know, we've got manufacturing, we've got office, we've got service workers. You know, how does that look today and how are employers looking at managing the workplace environment differently? Dave, why don't you take this and then we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, I think it varies greatly on what the business is. I mean, like, so for instance, if you're a professional services business, like insurance or like a law firm, you can just basically put everybody remote. I mean, that's what my firm did pretty much for the first 2 months of this. And we're still pretty much, there are several of my partners who still haven't come into the office, and they probably won't because they can do that. If you're in a manufacturing environment, that's a totally different animal. So I think you need to be my clients that deal with that, they right from the onset, they had to have very strict PPE policies to make sure that if somebody got infected outside the workplace, that when they came in, it didn't spread. And fortunately, fingers crossed, I haven't seen any in my cases where my clients, there has not been an employee to employee spread that occurred in the workplace because of their strong efforts to make sure everybody's wearing a mask. And that's critical. So I think it's important that you look at what's your business and how is the business operating and what are the critical aspects of your business? Do you really need to do this particular aspect in the office, or can we hire people to do this remotely? If you can do that, that's a better deal to do that. So I think it varies very greatly. And I think you need to, and again, I think it goes back to flexibility. I think employers need to be more flexible than they were in the past. I had employers who were dead against ever having anybody work from home, and I would have calls for them all the time on how to deal with that because people would ask for it as an accommodation for a disability. And then in a heartbeat, all of a sudden their entire workforce is working from home. And it was their worst nightmare. And in some instances, it worked out really well. In some instances, it didn't. I think it depends on the job and it depends on the employee. Some employees are better suited for it than others. I mean, I hate to use my wife as an example. My wife's been working home for 10 years now and doing it very successfully. Whereas other people, they haven't had so much success because they lose focus when they're at home. So I think you got to look at that as well.
And a white collar work environment, you know, that gives you a little bit more flexibility in a different way. Monica, what about the blue collar workers? How is it affected that way as an employer?
You know, primarily blue collar workers, for the most part, are essential workers, and they want to know that they are safe, that their employee, you know, well, in our case, we place people at other businesses, but I think it matters, you know, whether or not you're there on a temp to perm basis or a permanent basis. You want to know that the environment that you're working in is safe and that that company is taking every step possible to ensure your safety. And I think, you know, even in the blue collar world, it is more difficult, but now with Massachusetts sick time laws, it's important to reinforce to employees that they do have sick time available. And if they aren't feeling well, that they will take advantage of it, and how important it is for them to stay home if they're sick. That they have to be thinking of their fellow coworkers as well. So I think the employers need to stress that to employees. And then if they can provide a means, like if they will send people for testing if need be, anything that they can do, you know, to show that they care That's really going to go really far right now in keeping people content and less stressed, because everybody is highly stressed right now, and that's not good for anybody.
Hey, Lee, can I just jump in too? Because there was one other benefit that I think employers aren't necessarily aware of. So back in April, the federal government passed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And in that, it allows for, among other things, 2 weeks of paid sick leave for employees that are coronavirus related. And they don't necessarily just have to have coronavirus. They could be a person who's exposed to someone with COVID and has to self-isolate because of that. They could be treating someone or caring for someone for that. And then they have an extension to the paid family leave, or the Family Medical Leave Act, that's paid leave for employees whose childcare is closed due to COVID, or the fact that their school is remote, or stuff like that. So there are options under the federal law. And the nice part about that statute, even though it's annoying for employers to have more leave given to employees that's paid, to give them more excuses to stay out of work, the one nice thing about this, the payments that the employers have to make are fully reimbursable by the federal government through a tax credit. So it's something you should, if you have employees who are out on leave, you should talk to your accountants about how to get that, how to pay them and get the tax credit in return, because it's a little tricky. There's a lot of nuance to it, to the statute, but if you get good advice, it can be a good option to just using sick leave, vacation leave, because you're not just losing the money now, you're getting money back from the federal government.
Great point, David, to know that an employer doesn't have to shell out money, that they have some level of support from the federal government on that.
Mhm.
So great tip. And Monica, you mentioned basically it's the empathy of an employer, understanding what their needs are of their employees and understanding the circumstances that they're in as well. That's great.
Yeah, flexibility is key. The other point too, we've talked about people that work from home and may be having young children that they need time to care for. Don't forget about the people that don't have young children at home. So I've been reading more lately about those employees that are feeling a little slighted because they're not getting shown empathy or getting any kind of benefit. So I think employers also need to think about how to be fair to all their employees.
Right. That's a great point, because it's another variable that they have to deal with, and still maintain a business that's functional, that they can keep their employees, but understand the needs of their employees as well. We're bumping up against the top of the hour. I wanted to get to one last question, if we have it in the queue, Dominic, and address that.
Yeah, I have one final one, and we've talked about flexibility, we've talked about empathy, but this one's about productivity. And so Warren, this one's probably, as a chief people officer, this probably falls in your camp. But what are some strategies that employers are using in this environment just to make sure that their employees remain productive?
Great question, Dominic. And I touched on some of this earlier, but I'm going to reemphasize it if I can. So some employers don't use their employees to help develop their business strategy. And the question I have is, why not? They're engaged with you, they work for you, they come to work every day. It may be real important for you to take this opportunity right now to help them help you by developing that strategy, and be willing to fine tune it and look at it and have discussions with them on a monthly basis. It keeps them engaged. It keeps them focused on the business and not necessarily their worries as to what's going on in their personal or professional lives. So there's a side benefit to it. As Monica and David have said, remain flexible to their personal needs, family needs, as well as at work needs. We've had some discussions in other sessions about working that full 8 hours and not having a break other than a lunch break between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. or 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. and you're just going, if you're on a Zoom call all day long, going from call to call to call to call without breaks, not traveling in between. The flexibility also includes understanding you need to provide some break time for folks to wind down, to relax, and then encourage your employees to get more engaged with you to lessen some of their stress. So, I've seen success with some of my clients locally here on the Cape engage their employees by helping them have work huddles on a daily basis or weekly basis, just to problem solve. So what did we do yesterday that we could have improved upon? Simple question, but it's a 15-minute discussion. It's a lot easier in normal times, it seems, but take advantage of the times now to show them you care. And Monica's mentioned and David's mentioned that, and show them you value their participation to help that business succeed. Education and informing on best practices on and off the workplace are things that are critical, I think, to keep your employees more productive. The more you show them you care, the more they'll be responsive.
Exactly. That's a great point to close on. This has been a fantastic session. I think that we could probably go on for another hour or two on this, and maybe we will at a future session. I'd like to get to some key takeaways that we've put together on this call, and you see them coming up. That the key takeaway: planning and procedures, documenting your plans, communicating to your employees, having flexibility. Situations are different. Planning is different. The education for the owner, and changing rules to educate the workforce on changing policies and procedures. Very key. Consult with your professional advisors. You can't go it alone. Understanding what the legal ramifications are, the proper types of people to hire, how to manage that. Don't go it alone. And lastly, and most importantly, it's been a common thread here along with flexibility: communication, communication, communication. Talk with your employees, get an understanding of what they're doing, what they're feeling, letting them know ahead of time if there are going to be any changes so that everybody can plan and adapt to that. So great takeaways, fantastic session here. I think that you can see the resource that we have with three very, very, very well-versed and expertise in Monica, David, and Horan. I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us today. I know that we could talk a lot more about this. If there are any questions that we couldn't get to today, we'd like to let all of our attendees know that the contact information is on your screen. You can contact Monica, David, or Warren at any time for any follow-up questions you might have. So please reach out to them if you have any questions. As you can tell by today's session, they will be a tremendous resource to helping you and your business. The next thing we have is we do have another session coming up. We're continuing the area of expertise with people. Next Wednesday rather, is marketing and looking at new perspectives on marketing your business. That'll again be next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Hard to believe it's going to be the end of October, but it is. We have a great lineup of people that are going to be talking there. We have Andrea Gabrielle from Neptune Web, David Greenwood from Greenwood and Associates, and Katie Lehman of Lehman Communications and Collaboration. Again, that's going to be next Tuesday. Keep that on your schedule at 2 o'clock. You'll continue to see registration information on that. So we will be providing an email notice to each of you that have attended today, and provide you with the panelist information as well. So on behalf of the Business Advisory Group, Warren Rutherford, Dominic Rue, and myself would like to thank you for attending today. And again, thank you to Monica Horan, David Robinson, and Warren for being participants today on our great panel. Thank you again for attending. We look forward to seeing you at next week's session. Have a great day.
Thank you, Lee and Dominic,
Thank
and
you,
David
everyone.
and Monica.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
And we had a couple of questions at the end from Joe Bologna.